Hi, I want to read you my poem, but first, I want to talk to you guys about addiction and especially my experience with it, as well as, I guess, a couple of things that I've learned as I try to quit for the 100th time. So, I've been smoking for ages, especially cigarettes, probably since 16. I remember having my first one when I was going through my dad's hoarding room and I found this like really old deck that must have been there for like 10 years. They were French. And so old they didn't even have a filter. It was just straight tobacco. And I went and smoked them with my friends naturally, and God, they were awful. Like we were all quite sick, and fast forward now, I am addicted to that same thing essentially, which is so weird to think about. I didn't really start smoking consistently until I was like 18, 19, 20. And I remember around this time that I wasn't especially ignorant or naive to the effects of cigarettes, but rather I was ignorant to the belief that it would be myself that would be addicted. Instead, I thought, for whatever reason, I guess it was just hubris, that I would be different and that maybe my knowledge of the addiction meant that I wouldn't be the same. And sure enough, I was like really wrong, like really, really wrong. I was so sure that where I understood the addiction and I'd seen other people addicted, just like my father had been for years until he had children, I would be different for whatever reason. I'm sure that's something a lot of people believe relative to addiction. Just their knowledge of it can mean that they can avoid it or skirt around the edges. And, for some people, maybe they can, but I was definitely not that. And I followed in dad's footsteps and became really addicted, especially in my early 20s. So I'd say, yeah, around when I was 21, 22 and you full autonomy time, I'd really become addicted to cigarettes, where I was smoking probably like 4 or 5 a day, which wasn't that bad. I remember going to the doctor and speaking about that, especially relative to the fact that I had this asthma, and telling him that number, and he's like, "Oh, that's not that bad. Like when you're at a pack a day, that's when it's like bad, bad." And I was like, "Oh, okay." Foreboding, I guess. But yeah, at that time, it still wasn't something that I necessarily felt was a detriment of my life. Rather, I felt it was actually kind of handy. I quite enjoyed it. It was social. It kind of helped me focus weirdly. And I don't know, I definitely idealized it at that time. It was kind of a whole romantic thing for me to smoke a cigarette and have a coffee in the morning. And, I do kind of miss that a little bit, even as I speak about it now. I guess I didn't realize at that point how addicted I was, and I didn't really desire to change it. I was pretty happy with these little vices. Except for drinking, I never was really a drinker, but with the smoking, I became really intertwined with these things and I couldn't put them down. And the same thing happened with weed slowly, whereupon where I would smoke maybe on the weekends. Then it became, every second or third day, and then it became every day, and then it became every day and night. So it's the same thing with cigarettes. Is it wasn't like I woke up one day and became a chain smoker, like most people probably don't. It's more so I woke up like years later, inundated with these vices that I'd once held at an arm's length, and now I like cuddled as I slept. So yeah, it's kind of weird as the time passes to really acknowledge. And at that time, I guess it was easier off not acknowledging, especially for the fact that I never really viewed these addictions and my addictive personality per se as anything strictly deeper than that, if that makes sense. It was purely just me enjoying the substance and having fun and being young. And I guess in that, I always used the idea that I had an addictive personality as a crutch, which isn't really scientifically backed to any strict degree, the idea of an addictive personality. I think that pattern of behavior, though, is quite common, and it can definitely be an indicator of deeper issues. And for me, it was definitely an indicator of that, and just something I probably couldn't reconcile at that time. And instead, I would smoke and feel really shitty and just think that was life, especially with the weed. The weed is super weird because I was having panic attacks when I smoked weed a lot and very young. And so I don't know how I reconciled that when I was younger. I can't even strictly remember. I think I just drew it up to my own just inherent anxiousness and never really viewed it as maybe some internal dissonance or something else I was dealing with. And it's weird. It can be kind of like an oxymoron or a paradox, because the substances can help with those issues, but then at the same time they can further incite them. So I think that's what was happening with the weed, where it would make me really anxious sometimes, but then it would also comfort my anxiousness sometimes. So it became this weird dichotomy of a relationship where I quite enjoyed it, but I also could recognize it was harmful for me. But I guess in those situations, the enjoyment supersedes the harm, just for the fact that it's really accessible and it's a shallow comfort is better than no comfort at all, I guess. There's this really brilliant book that I got my hands on by this guy called Gabor Mate. You may have heard of him. You may have seen him on your Instagram reels. He's always there. He's that really sweet older man with the really velvety voice. And he speaks a lot about childhood trauma. And he published this really brilliant book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And that book really speaks poignantly on addiction and how it interlinks with childhood trauma. And I really suggest anybody who's wishing to delve into maybe why they're addicted beyond the surface level of the chemical response to read that, especially if they feel like they are dealing with, or they're using addiction to resolve some of those issues or blanket some of those issues. I actually want to read a couple quotes from that book because Dr. Mate I think he's a doctor, but Dr. Mate he's really great. I love him. All right, here's a quote. Dismissing addictions as bad habits or self-destructive behavior comfortably hides their functionality in the life of the addict. It is impossible to understand addiction without asking what relief the addict finds or hopes to find in the drug or the addictive behavior. So kind of what I was saying, but in a far more eloquent way, in that, it's easy to interpret these addictions on face value and view them as just that and kind of be self-deprecating for that you're dealing with this addiction and it's hard to kick and you don't know why, and you have that addictive personality like I was relying upon. But I think in understanding truly why you may feel the need to have a vice and have a vice so voraciously, I guess, or consistently, or you need it to function at the point in which I got to a couple years later, then I think it's worth delving into why that may be beyond the fact that you just like these things. Because I think for a lot of people that are addicted, you probably understand that it's not simply for the fact that you like these things. You may not even like these things at all. I definitely started to resent them, and that definitely compounds how you feel. It doesn't make you feel any better about it. Okay, one more quote. Addiction is passion's dark simulacrum, and to the naive observer, its perfect mimic. It resembles passion in its urgency and in the promise of fulfillment, but its gifts are illusory. It's a black hole. So good. Read that book if you desire to. I never really read a lot of nonfiction back in the day, but there's a couple that are really great, and that's one of them. So yeah, I think Dr. Mate highlights a really crucial step in overcoming addictions, which is first of all to understand that, of course, you have one. I think that is like the preliminary step, like the first step is understanding you have an addiction, for one. And then I guess beyond that, it would be understanding maybe why you feel the need to rely on that addiction so direly. And that can be obviously really hard. I mean, even acknowledging you have an addiction is really hard. I remember, up until my early 20s, 22, 23, only then was I like, okay, I'm desperately addicted. When I was reaching a point of about half a pack a day, and I was smoking weed every day and night, then I was like, okay, this is very obviously an addiction. And it can really whack you on the head at that point. And it's a shame to get to that point and then realize it. And I maybe wish I could have realized sooner, but that can be really difficult, especially when you can manage your addiction a lot better, like a lot of people can, in amongst their other routine, rather than letting it supersede everything. But for me, it really became the focal point of my entire life, which I guess made it really apparent that was really becoming the dominant aspect of my entire life, and a negative one in that. It's funny, around that time, even though I felt so addicted, I guess I made this I developed this coat for myself where I really believed that these things were kind of helping me be myself. I'm like, oh, they help me think and they help me feel comfortable. And perhaps at the time they did, in the sense that they were allowing me to be comfortable in a place I otherwise wouldn't be. When I started reflecting on my behavior around that time and how I felt when I didn't have these substances, when I didn't have that cigarette in the morning, and how irate I would feel for the rest of the day, or when I didn't have weed at night and I couldn't sleep at all, I guess it really made me recognize how dependent I become on these things. And if you ever feel yourself so dependent on a substance, I think at that point you can really separate your desire and your enjoyment on it from the fact that it has become something that takes from you rather than you are taking anything from it. And it can be really taxing in that and draining. And I'd found myself almost like zombified, where I was propped up by these vices, and without them, I really couldn't function that well. And I think at that point I could realize okay, I had a really serious issue and I wanted to change it, although I don't think I really understood how I could change it at that point. Rather, I maybe beat myself up a bit for it and felt worse furthermore for the fact that I did feel so dependent and I needed these things and I wasn't ready to relinquish them. I think I was maybe too young or just unready relative to other issues in my life, akin to childhood trauma, like I was speaking about before, and a lot of regret and the anxiety that I was talking about, whereupon it felt easier to rely on these things than try to go it alone, especially as I was trying to study and I was trying to work on my relationships with people and be more social. It can be really difficult to take this whole holistic journey and rid yourself of all vices. It's not as simple as just cutting down. And I remember trying to wean off a lot and that never worked. The only thing that ever really worked for me was going cold turkey. And yeah, another way I think I realized just the sheer level of my addiction at that point was how dire it felt that I needed these things when I didn't have them. Like my brain would be screaming at me to buy more cigarettes if I ran out, or I had this mental gymnastics that I was like, okay, if I'm gonna stop, I need to at least get to the end of the week and have enough for the end of the week. And I'd kind of mentally map out how it would go. And of course, when I ran out, a new voice would be like, okay, you need some more, and you start again. And again, you create these parameters for yourself to keep the habit comfortable, I feel. And for me, it was this belief that I guess I could manage it by way of keeping mental check of how I was going and just endlessly postponing quitting, like a procrastination of sorts, which essentially it can be when you're trying to quit. And I think in amongst that, as the years passed and I reached, my mid-20s and the habit wasn't as fresh or exciting anymore, my inability to kick it bred this underlying resentment towards the cigarettes, I guess, in a sense, but relative to how entwined they were with my personality, that just made me resent myself, So that compounds where you feel further frustrated, and so you probably smoke some more, and once that wears off, you feel even more frustrated, and you should probably smoke some more. And at that point, of course, relative to the snowballing effects of addiction, I needed more of these substances for it to really do much at all. Whereupon, one cigarette was making me sick back in the day and giving me ungodly spins. Now I rarely get any sort of sensation, especially from the cigarettes. And it was more just that I was this dire creature of habit where I needed these things in order to feel like myself. No longer did I feel like they helped me be myself. They were who I was. And yeah, I wanted to be more than that for sure. And I think recognizing that again was really important to starting to unwind from that. And definitely feeling frustrated in myself was not the best place to put that feeling, but sometimes it can be hard not to be self-deprecatory, especially when you feel almost stupid for becoming so swept up in the throes of addiction. Something, again, where I felt it could never happen. And, understanding that I was addicted definitely helped, and realizing my resentment towards the addictions was a great first step, but it in no way enabled me to quit any easier. If anything, it made me more frustrated. And I think it's a good time to say I'm definitely not a medical professional at all. And these are serious issues with people with even stronger vices deal with. And this is purely my experience with addiction. I just wanted to share it in hopes that maybe it can help or shine light on some other people's experience and help them reflect themselves. I'm going to link a couple sites below that are really helpful if you truly are dealing with addiction and need help. I cannot help fix your addiction. I just want to help speak about it. And I think speaking about these things is really important, so it feels more normalized and you don't feel so alone in dealing with it like I felt for a long time, as well as just even being helpful for me, because sometimes it's hard for me to really reflect on how I got here. And as I try to quit again, I think it's really helpful that I just look back and hopefully understand where I'm at and heed that in order to not fall into that bear trap again. But yes, if you need help with addiction and you need help with addiction, please do get proper help. Don't allow it to fester for longer. It's just going to make your life more miserable, even if it feels comfortable right now. It takes a lot of courage to recognize you do have an addiction or an issue, and that isn't something you should be shameful of, and rather you should take confidence in the fact that you do want better for yourself. I think that's really powerful in believing. that first of all, you do want better, and second of all, that there is better. And then in desiring that, there already is, you already are on the way. But yeah, there will be a couple of things down below that I think are far more helpful than I could ever be. It takes a lot more than yourself a lot of the time, especially in these grander changes. So it's not something to be shameful about. Like, I used to feel quite ashamed that I felt that I needed help extraneous to myself. And it's quite the opposite. I think if anything, that kind of makes you stronger for the desire of wanting to get better. You should take confidence in that, in knowing that you are better than this thing. And it's something that's holding you back from being a more desired version of yourself. So yeah, back to the story. And in those next 3 years, when I had recognized that, and I was in probably the deepest throes of addiction that I'd ever dealt with, I found myself quitting and starting a lot, and quitting and starting and quitting and starting. And that's its own torture. I think it can be really liberating to quit that first time, and you get the adrenaline of feeling better momentarily, and you can almost lull yourself into this sense of comfort whereupon you're like, one cigarette can't hurt, or maybe I could smoke a little weed with some friends. And, again, for some people that is okay. And I'm not here to say abstain from every single vice in your life for eternity and never do anything enjoyable. But if you do find yourself with that addictive personality per se, or you feel you are using these substances as a vice, and you've recognized your relationship with them as being quite unhealthy and something that you can't manage, it's probably wiser not to dip your toes back into that pool lest you drown again. I remember there was this one New Year's Eve where it was like 2-3 years ago, where I'd been pretty good. I think it'd been like 6 months without smoking cigarettes and weed. I usually try to quit both cold turkey when I quit, which is annoying, but just a clean break, I guess. So yeah, I was 6 months in, and it was New Year's Eve, and we were at the Parliament steps in Melbourne, and I was with a couple of friends, and it just felt like the perfect picturesque evening that would be really complemented by having a cigarette. And so I went and bought a deck and had one with my friends, and I really wanted them to have the deck. I was like, I don't want to keep it. I did end up keeping it, and naturally, just having it in my room, it was like speaking to me, like the Green Goblin's mask or something. Surely enough, I again made this excuse in my mind that if I finished that deck, then I would stop again. And again, I started setting these new goalposts again and again. And before I knew it, I was heavily addicted once again, maybe even heavier, because it can compound not only the familiarity and falling back into that shallow comfort, but then also the resentment that you build. So not only was I smoking for my addiction and my prior addiction, but I was also smoking to overcome the feelings of regret and shame I felt historically as well as presently relative to falling back into that trap. I think there's also this like nihilistic notion that you can become swept up in, that, life is rough and things are really horrible, so why not do these things? And life is short and you could die at any moment, so why does it matter? I should just smoke. And I definitely lent on that as some reasoning as to why I should continue, especially in those darker moments when I felt that I'd really been overcome by the addiction yet again, and that I couldn't imagine myself starting that climb out of that hole once again. I think it's easier sometimes to reconcile in yourself that this is okay, rather than maintaining the belief that it isn't. And yeah, it can be really difficult to overcome that feeling, especially just for the sheer accessibility of these vices. If you have friends that smoke or drink or do drugs. I remember rather dramatically around that time when I had that like sheer dissonance that I would buy a whole deck of cigarettes and smoke a couple, and then very dramatically I would snap the whole deck in half and put it in the bin, or flush the weed down the toilet, very triumphantly and performatively. And then the next day I would shamefully, like a rat, just like scrounge around and try to find these things again. And I think that just speaks to how visceral like the dissonance was at that point, in terms of me knowing that I really didn't want this thing, and then really struggling to break that physical habit, especially probably because I'd still not dealt strictly with those underlying issues, which is again not a black and white process, not maybe something you'll ever do in your journey with addiction, but it definitely can be conducive towards you leaning on these things for longer and returning to them and the comfort of them, just like the comfort of those negative memories even, and those negative feelings. It can be a weird self-indulgent misery of sorts, and an addiction of itself, I feel. So yeah, it's been like a month since I've quit pretty much, and I've quit for much longer, so I'm not here to say like I've solved it, I figured it out, not by any means. I'm sure I still have a long way to go, but yeah, it's been good. I mean, those first 2 weeks are really difficult every time, and they make me really angry. They make me lash out a lot, and I struggle to eat. But in amongst that, there is some really great stuff, especially in getting rid of the weed. I started to dream again. People that are addicted to weed might know this, in that you don't really get any REM sleep, which I'm sure is really detrimental. But it's nice that I've been having dreams, although they're really vivid and weird. And then with the smoking, with both types, I guess it was really screwing up my sinuses, so I couldn't really smell ever. So it was kind of nice to smell the winter air and stuff. I really like all that. I think it's important to count those little wins, as much as it is difficult to reconcile how you feel in those moments. There's really brilliant things that come about quitting, even in those initial stages, especially saving the money, because God, is it expensive here to smoke. And it's also, you also stink less. You also feel less self-conscious about being around certain people and certain family and children. My mum hated it. And I could just tell she was like kind of disappointed, although she would never strictly say it. She would allude to wanting me to quit, but she understood it was of my own volition, which I don't even know if it was at that point, but it was by my design, and it's my responsibility at the end of the day, like it is yours, to deal with your addiction. It can be nobody else's. As much as other people can drive you to want to quit, you have to want to as well to really overcome that, I believe. When you're initially quitting in those first couple of weeks, it can be really easy to relent for the fact that you probably won't feel a great deal better, especially in those first couple of weeks. And then maybe even beyond that, you may not feel a great deal better. If anything, you'll probably feel more bored. You'll have a great void relative to the amount of dopamine that you're getting out of these things. And it's really easy to either relent due to that, for the fact that you feel, that you've seen the other side and it wasn't a great deal prettier in the sense of getting sober, or rather than that, you put your addictive behavior somewhere else in terms of, maybe a different vice, or you start drinking, which is something I used to try to do when I was weaning off the cigarettes, as though that would fill a void. Luckily, I just do not like it for the most part, so it didn't stick, but obviously not a good idea. Instead, I think what I find myself doing, especially even recently, is just getting on my phone and scrolling and kind of using that as the addictive behavior to, blank in my mind when it's craving that dopamine fix that I become so accustomed to, especially in the short term, that reward-seeking behavior that it becomes really ingrained into you. And I think the addictive personality that we were talking about prior is something that can be developed by allowing your brain to become accustomed to the need for short-term reward all the time. And what better to do that than your phone? And I'll probably speak about that another time. But yeah, don't feel embarrassed by relenting in those first couple of weeks. That's probably the brunt of where my quitting and starting and quitting occurred, is in those first couple of weeks. And in those broader stretches, I think you obviously feel better after that first month probably, but along with that, you also find other habits that are healthier. And beyond the whole reward-seeking behaviors thing, it can also be relative to the fact that you're still dealing with those underlying issues that are plaguing you beyond those addictions. And sobering up may not necessarily make it easier to deal with them. If anything, it can make them more visceral. So that can be really painful in of itself, but it gives you a great opportunity to actually address these things where the addictions can never truly do so. It's they're just masquerading as a solution, like Dr. Mate was saying. So yeah, I think it can be really beneficial in using those first few weeks, especially where your brain is craving some sort of habit to fill the void of those vices, to try to implement something healthy, whether it be working out or even something more miniature like walking or reading, especially like reading. Please read. Another video, please read. It's really important that in those patches of sobriety that you attempt to build some structure for yourself beyond the vices, because if not, when that addiction comes crawling back, if you have a night out or even if you just have a really terrible day or a terrible period of time, it can be really easy to look to your prior addictions as what could help if you have nothing else in life that's really bringing you joy per se, especially nothing as consistent and as relieving in the short term as your vices. And yeah, I think addiction is quite commonplace mentally in most all of us in one way or another. But managing that and managing the focal point of those addictions is really important. Video games, like anything, collecting something, just something that brings you joy beyond your vices, something healthier, something that doesn't cause a dependence in that sense. You know, you need to create new desires, of course. But yeah, in that, I think there's a couple things that really helped me in overcoming my addiction, and I want to get into those finally before I read you my poem. And yeah, they've made me feel really confident in feeling that this may well be the time that I do quit for good. And in that, I think what's also helped me is the fact that I just realized it'd been like a really long time. Like I said, it's almost been 10 years now, like 8-10 years since I started smoking initially, and then 5 years probably of actual habitual smoking. And just it kind of got boring. Like I felt like I've been smoking for so long now that I just almost feel exhausted by it, and I want to craft an identity beyond that. So yeah, I recognize that you may be far earlier into your addiction or far later, and it's completely unique. But hopefully at a point you realize that you do want more, and I definitely want more. Okay, so one, I think it is absolutely vital that you find something that you care about more than your vices. And I know I was speaking about just before the idea that when you're quitting, just to find something to do that might be helpful. That isn't strictly the same as this. Here, I'm also mean, you know, a great deal of me struggling to quit is that I had no broader desire for why I would even need to quit. It was more so the notion that I kind of knew morally I should, and health-wise I should, and it was making me anxious. But I had no clear idea of why I would desire to beyond the fact that these things were bad, rather than having any sort of aspiration for good beyond the fact that perhaps I wanted to feel a bit better. But I think in honing and having a clearer focus on maybe a couple of things or one thing that you really desire from your sober self can really help set in motion that momentum towards quitting. In that, you know, for instance, there's a lot of adults that I speak to and I ask them how they went in quitting and when they decided to quit. And most all of them, I feel, talk about quitting when they were having a child. And obviously that's a huge pivotal moment in their lives and a great reason to quit, and something that was almost a necessity for them, you know, for the well-being of their child. But for those of you that aren't having a child anytime soon, I think it can be helpful to find something prior to that. Like, you don't want to wait till you're having a baby, if ever, to quit smoking. But it's kind of an example of, at a point, people realize that they can quit, or they must, for the fact that there is something greater in their lives that requires their responsibility. So in finding that, I feel like it can give you the power beyond your desire. It can give you a level of confidence in your attempts to quit, and that you have a clear vision of something that you really care about beyond the smoking. Maybe it can be a goal, or, you know, a dream, or yeah, it might not be for a baby per se, but maybe you want to quit for a specific person. Like maybe you want to quit for your parents, or maybe you want to quit for your partner who hates it, or maybe more personally, it can be for the fact that you want to have clearer thoughts, or you want to be able to do specific things that you can't currently, you know, akin to writing more, or reading more, or saving money where you can't, or buying a car, or buying a specific thing, or going to a specific place. Having that goal in mind and having a clear idea of these things, or maybe multiple things, or this one thing, can really spurn you to have a clearer understanding of why you want to quit, rather than just that innate desire. And then in that, it probably feels more feasible, you know, just like it's strictly feasible when you have a child. It's almost a must, like you have to do it. Make these ideas as vital, you know, understand that you are making it far more difficult to achieve these things the longer you're stuck in your habits, you know, the longer your attention is so focused and your mental energy is so drained and exhausted by these vices. The more difficult those goals come to ever reach, the more time passes where you struggle rather than where you grow, you know, and you deserve to grow. You have all measure of capacity to grow. And you need to show yourself that and prove to yourself that. And that can only happen in growing towards something. Because unfortunately, the time does pass. And, you know, years and years have passed now where I wish I'd quit prior, for sure. And rather than regret that and regret, your inability in the past. Be hopeful in the fact that you still have so much time now to quit. But yeah, you really need to desire more for yourself beyond just getting sober. I think the notion of wanting to get sober is really good, but by having that clear purpose and having a greater overarching goal, one that is hard, you know, something that's difficult, can really spurn you to relinquish those addictions and seek to grow rather than spend a great deal of your time healing, you know? It can be such a tiresome balancing act doing all those things and keeping up with your vices and the time and mental effort and energy and money spent towards them, all the while trying to achieve these things. Imagine how much easier it would be if you didn't have that encumbering you all the while. It's like, it is definitely something that has been really relieving since quitting. Just the sheer clarity that you'll find in yourself and in being able to reflect and being able to understand and being able to dream is really refreshing. One of my greatest desires was wanting my memory to improve, because the weed had really destroyed it, and I'd found myself trailing off in thoughts as I was having them, and it was a really weird, hazy feeling. And beyond that, I really desired to write more. So obviously in tandem with writing, that made it really difficult. And I think a lot of these vices, you probably don't realize how difficult they make the other enjoyable parts of your life, or how less enjoyable, even if you may feel like they enhance them. It's rarely the case. Like, I used to feel that I enjoyed things more while I was high, and I think at a point after doing that for so long, you realize that being sober and appreciating things in clarity is actually really refreshing. And I hope you can find some joy in that as well. I think that was always such a difficult thing for me, because I felt that it took some actual work, you know? It wasn't just dependent on some short-term gratification. Like, I actually needed to put in some time and effort. And I think when you're in the throes of that addictive mentality, it inundates you with a sense of complacency, which by virtue of that makes it difficult to put effort into anything beyond those vices, especially not to the degree that you may want to. So yeah, hopefully in creating this channel and making this silly video, I can stave off the addiction for good and desire more for myself. But you know, I acknowledge this is still a journey, and I may well slip up again, and I'm going to try my best not to crucify myself for that, just as you shouldn't. I've failed many times prior, and I probably will again, and that's okay, you know? Also, as I touched on earlier, I feel like just believing or desiring to change is really indicative of a self-love that you may not even realize is there. So it's really important to hone that and indulge in that and recognize within yourself that even if you feel like shit, and even if you feel like you aren't especially lovable, you do have a love for yourself. And look, it can be really hard to be kind to yourself in failure. And I know for a long time I wasn't, and I was really demeaning towards myself, and I would really beat myself up when I fell back into that hole again. But something that really helped me with that was simply just reframing how I perceive those failures. That is to say, you know, I think for a long time I got caught up in this feeling of being a perennial failure, you know, that I was doomed to live out this Sisyphean life where I would be rolling the boulder up the hill time and time again, destined to start over and over again and not really changing anything. Not only in addictions, but in jobs, you know, in relationships, in study. And that can breed a lot of resentment and regret. And beyond that, it can just be really exhausting to feel like you're starting over, you know, getting back up on that proverbial horse time and time again, you know, that's a big horse. And I believe this feeling can almost be like self-perpetuating, you know, you develop this failure as a habit, and you mentally set the parameters for your failure before you've even reached them. And so I think I'd begun to do that, where I almost expected that as the outcome. And naturally, in expecting that, I'm also lent towards doing that time and time again. I felt it easier. I almost cushioned the failure for myself, and I allowed it to happen, you know, I guess in believing that at least that way it wouldn't hurt as much. And that's definitely a modicum of shame, and, you know, maybe some self-indulgent pain, which I spoke on before, as being quite addictive in of itself. But of course, that's really, it can be really harmful and antithetical to any real change in indulging in that time and time again. And that feeling can keep you really tied to your past self, you know, unsure of whether you can ever outgrow that person for the fact that you've built that cycle for yourself. But in torturing myself for so long with this cruel reminder of my failures time and time again, I think at a point in examining my life more broadly and observing, you know, other failures per se in relationships and in career, in work and in study, observing it more broadly, I think it can be really beneficial to acknowledge that you're never really starting again. As silly as that sounds to say, you are the sum of all those people that have failed before. And in that, you have learned things, even if you feel like you haven't. Especially with addiction, I can say each time I quit, when I went to quit again, I had more belief that I could do it, not less. And when I didn't have that belief, it was me falling back into the habit of shame rather than relying on the fact that I had tried to quit before, not that I'd failed before, you know, and those things are parallel and they exist simultaneously. So rather than lamenting on the failures, I think it can be really helpful to acknowledge your attempts in superseding that failure, because that can build a confidence for the fact that you can be infallible in that. You can be tireless in endeavoring towards change, even if you are screwing up again and again and again. And you should have confidence in that, in the fact that you are never truly starting over. As much as it may feel like you are, you're not. You are a sum of your many attempts, and whether you feel it or not, your body remembers. You have learned, your body has prefaced itself. It's more ready than it's ever been, evidence in the fact that you want to change, here again, even after those failures. The fact that you endeavor again and again and again, as long as you do that, the journey towards whatever you're trying to achieve never truly ends, you know? So believe that. Believe you are never starting again. As something that really helped me. It sounds so silly, but in acknowledging that, it really gave me confidence that I would quit one day, even if it wasn't today or tomorrow. As long as I desired to quit and I understood that I hadn't failed, I'd hit a bump in the road in my journey towards quitting. You know, it's an endless journey, really, one that never ends. And I don't know if I'll ever stop desiring some of those vices, but it feels really great having some semblance of control over them rather than being at the whim to them always. I think you gain some control even in your understanding of your addictions and in understanding of your failures. You gain some controls. You're not at a whim to your failures, you know? You're merely a vessel for them and somebody that can learn from them. And what better to do in life than learn from your mistakes rather than be cruelled by them? And I think both can happen and both will happen, and both have definitely happened to me. But in the long term, just acknowledge and be confident in the fact that you are never starting again. I'm going to say it a million times. You are never starting again, okay? Even if it feels like you are, you aren't. You really aren't. There's a great merit in that, I feel, like a latent confidence that can be assumed in understanding that even though in a linear sense you may not be failing less and less, you compound your knowledge and your belief and your confidence through trying again and again, not through giving up. And by reflecting on your attempts for good rather than your failures, it can reframe your own ability. Rather than feeling that you have no likelihood in escaping these cycles, understand that you've already shown proof of your ability to do so, your ability to desire to do so, which is far greater than a lot of people. And not to admonish them, but rather to speak power to what you're doing. And it can be really difficult to even want to change, you know, especially when you feel like change is really difficult. So as hard as the change becomes, as long as you rise to meet it, the stronger you'll become. And I have no doubt in that. You are never starting over. You aren't. There's a strength that we can embody in acknowledging our capacity for infinite attempts of anything, even in the face of infinite failures. It shouldn't be dissuading, although of course it is going to feel that way. Rest in peace, the great Bob Ross, and he put it really simply and eloquently when he said, as long as you're learning, you're not failing. And you should never stop seeking to learn, and you are always learning through whatever you're going through, as long as you desire to do so, and as long as you desire to change. There's always things to heed in your experience, you know, both good and bad. Okay, thank you so much for listening to my ramblings. I truly appreciate it, and I appreciate you being here. And I promise these videos will be better and more cohesive in the future. And I'll leave you with my poem now. It's called Lapse. So addicted that you can't remember your convictions. It appears in pictures like a memory distant. The next minute it's itching, find something to fix it. Smoke 1 or 10 cigarettes just to feel a breath different. And walk around the pool but refuse to jump in it. Lapse and lapse as you watch the drowning bugs. Save a few from time to time, play a purpose for fun. I saved a sullen bee on a sunny Wednesday. One leg twitched and its wings crumpled in. I gave it CPR and offered it to the sun, and for a moment its prickled legs glistened orange like an autumn forest. It stirred and turned and stood on my finger triumphant, revived, yet as much as it tried it couldn't fly. The bee fell to the bricks as it attempted to venture anew, but its legs couldn't follow its eyes. Its body crawled to the right and to the right and to the right, turning in circles like it did in the pool, Was saving it cruel? Did I save it at all? I thought it must mean something because it made me cry as I watched it die on a dried leaf. I gave it sugar water, but it was already deceased. Wings spread stiff, forever flying, never walking.